The Riverside Diner sat on the corner of Oak and Maple like a forgotten postcard from another era, its neon sign flickering with the stubbornness of something that refused to die. The building had weathered 43 Ohio winters, each one leaving its mark in the form of hairline cracks along the foundation and a slight lean to the eastern wall that newcomers noticed but regulars had long stopped seeing. Inside, the vinyl booths had faded from cherry red to something closer to dried blood, and the linoleum floor bore the scuff marks of 10,000 work boots, each one carrying its own story of labor and loss. The smell hit you before anything else. Coffee that had been sitting too long mixed with bacon grease in the faint undertone of industrial cleaner that never quite masked the decades of accumulated humanity. It was the kind of smell that wrapped around you like an old blanket, simultaneously comforting and suffocating, depending on what you were running from. Every Friday at 7 o'clock, a man walked through the door. Thomas Hayes moved like someone carrying weight that others could not see. His shoulders, once broad and proud from years of physical work, had begun to curve inward, as though protecting something fragile in his chest. At 42, he looked older, the kind of aging that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with the way grief etches itself into the bones. His hair, once the color of rich earth, had surrendered to gray at the temples, and his eyes, a shade somewhere between storm clouds and shallow water, held the particular emptiness of a man who had stopped looking for anything. He always took the same booth, corner right side next to the window that looked out onto the parking lot, where pickup trucks and sedans sat under the yellow glow of sodium lights. The seat squeaked under his weight as he slid in, and he placed his hands flat on the table, studying the grain of the wood as though it might reveal something he had missed in the hundreds of times he had done this before. Dorothy Brennan appeared without being called. 62 years old with silver hair pinned up in a style that had not changed since 1987, she carried 2 plates balanced on her forearm with the practiced ease of someone who had done this long enough to forget she was doing it. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, brown gravy pooling in the wells between the food. She set one plate in front of Thomas, the other across the table where the vinyl booth sat empty, and she did not say a word. 3 years ago, she might have asked, "Who is joining you tonight? Can I get you anything else? Is everything all right, honey?" But Dorothy Brennan had learned that some silences were not meant to be broken and some rituals were not meant to be questioned. She topped off his water glass from the pitcher she carried, her eyes meeting his for just a moment long enough to confirm that he was still breathing, still present in some minimal way, and then she retreated to the counter where the coffee pots waited like sentinels. Thomas stared at the second plate. The meatloaf was already beginning to cool the gravy, developing that thin skin that meant it had been sitting too long. Steam still rose from the mashed potatoes, but it was fading wisps of warmth escaping into the stale air of the diner. He would sit like this for 45 minutes, maybe an hour. He would eat his own meal slowly, mechanically chewing without tasting, swallowing without satisfaction. And when he was finished, he would signal for Dorothy to box up the untouched plate, and he would carry it home and he would throw it away. Every Friday for 3 years, the booth held more than food. On the edge of the seat, hooked over the vinyl back, a child's backpack hung from its straps. Blue with a faded Spider-Man logo that had once been bright and proud. The fabric had worn thin in places, and one of the zippers had broken sometime in the second year, but Thomas had not repaired it. He had not moved it. He had not touched it except in brief moments when his hand would reach across the table, fingers brushing the strap the way you might touch a photograph of someone you were trying not to forget. The backpack belonged to Jamie. Jamie would have been 10 years old now, double digits the age when boys started thinking about real bikes instead of the ones with training wheels, when they developed opinions about music and started rolling their eyes at their fathers in that way that was simultaneously infuriating and hilarious. Jamie would have been in 4th grade, probably complaining about math homework, probably begging for a later bedtime, probably asking when he could finally learn to ride one of the motorcycles that his father fixed in the shop on the east side of town. But Jamie was not 10. Jamie would never be 10. Jamie had stopped at 7, frozen in time on a Wednesday afternoon in October, when a pickup truck ran a red light at 60 miles per hour, and the world split into before and after. Thomas reached across the table and touched the backpack strap. The fabric was cool under his fingers, smoother than it should have been from the thousands of times he had done this. He closed his eyes for a moment, and he could almost hear it. The voice, High and clear like a bell, always too loud for indoor spaces, always running ahead of the words themselves. Dad, I want extra gravy. You have enough gravy to swim in, buddy. But I want more. Thomas opened his eyes. The booth was empty. The plate was cold. The backpack hung silent and still. He picked up his fork and began to eat. The people of Millbrook, Ohio knew his story the way small towns know all stories, through whispers and glances, and the careful dance of not quite looking at someone when they passed on the street. They knew about Linda, his wife, who had died of breast cancer when Jamie was 5. They knew about the accident, the drunk driver who had walked away with a broken collarbone while a 7-year-old boy lay still on the pavement. They knew about the way Thomas had retreated into himself afterward, closing the expanded operations of his motorcycle shop, turning away customers who wanted to pay extra for his expertise, becoming a ghost in his own life. Some of them pitied him. These were the ones who looked at him with soft eyes and spoke in careful tones, asking how he was doing in ways that made it clear they did not actually want to know. Others avoided him entirely, crossing the street when they saw him coming, because grief was contagious in their minds, something that could spread through proximity. A few, the bold ones, or perhaps the cruel ones, had told him to move on. Let go. Stop torturing yourself. Find a new purpose. Their words bounced off him like rain off stone, absorbed and forgotten. Dorothy understood in a way the others did not. She had lost her husband in Vietnam, received the telegram when she was 26 years old, and 3 months pregnant with a child who would grow up never knowing his father. She knew that grief was not something you moved on from. It was something you moved with, like a limp that became part of your walk, like a scar that faded but never disappeared. She never told Thomas to let go. She just brought the 2 plates every Friday, boxed up the untouched one every Friday, and let him sit in his corner booth for as long as he needed. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in 3 years. The clock on the wall read 7:15. Thomas had been sitting for 15 minutes and he had not yet picked up his fork. Tonight felt different, somehow heavier than usual. The weight in his chest had a particular quality to it, a sharpness that made breathing feel like effort. He knew why. The calendar in his apartment, the one he never changed, was still turned to October, and the date circled in red marker was approaching. Jamie's birthday. The boy would have been 10 years old, a decade of life that would never happen. Little league games and school plays and first crushes and all the mundane miracles that parents took for granted until they were gone. Thomas would never teach his son to drive, would never watch him graduate from anything, would never dance at his wedding or hold his grandchildren or grow old knowing that some part of him would continue after he was gone. The emptiness was absolute. It filled him like water, filling a drowning man's lungs, pressing outward against his ribs, making everything feel distant and muffled. He was here in this booth, in this diner, and he was also somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed only in the space between heartbeats, where Jamie was still alive and Linda was still singing in the kitchen, and the world had not yet learned how to break. He reached for the backpack strap again, held it. Let the fabric remind him that this was real, that it had happened, that the boy who once wore this backpack had existed and laughed and loved and been loved. The door of the diner opened. Cold air rushed in November wind that carried the bite of Lake Erie and the promise of a hard winter. Thomas did not look up. He rarely looked up when the door opened. The world came and went around him, and he existed within it without participating, a stone in a stream, watching the water flow past. But something made him raise his eyes. A woman stood near the entrance, thin and pale, in a coat that was several sizes too large for her frame. The coat looked like it belonged to a man, brown canvas worn at the elbows, buttons straining where they should not have been because they were in the wrong holes. Her hair was brown and tangled, and her face had the particular gauntness of someone who had not eaten properly in too long. She stood hesitantly, not quite inside and not quite outside, as though unsure whether she had the right to occupy this space. Behind her, half hidden by her legs, a child. Thomas's chest tightened. The boy was small, perhaps 6 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were too large for his thin face. He wore clothes that were dirty and wrinkled, the kind of dirty that came from wearing the same outfit for too many days in a row, and he clung to his mother's leg with both hands, fingers digging into the fabric of her coat, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. The boy's eyes moved around the diner, taking in the booths and the counter and the fluorescent lights, and there was something in them that Thomas recognized. Fear, hunger, the particular wariness of a child who had learned that the world was not a safe place. Dorothy emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, with the efficiency of someone who had seen this before and knew what to do about it. She approached the woman, and Thomas could hear the exchange even from across the room. "Can I help you?" The woman's voice was barely a whisper, roughened by exhaustion or tears or both. Is it okay if we sit down for a minute, just to rest?" Dorothy's expression softened, but her posture remained firm. "This is a restaurant, honey. You need to order something if you want to sit." "I know." The woman's voice cracked on the second word. "We don't have anything right now. I'm sorry. The boy looked up at his mother, and something in his face, something in the naked hunger and fear that he could not hide, struck Thomas like a physical blow. He was on his feet before he knew he was moving. The booth squeaked as he slid out, and he was crossing the diner, his boots heavy on the worn linoleum, and the words were coming out of his mouth before he had time to think about them. "They're with me." Dorothy turned, surprise flickering across her features. In 3 years, Thomas Hayes had not spoken to another person in this diner beyond the bare minimum required to order food and pay his bill. He had not invited anyone to his booth. He had not acknowledged that other people existed except as obstacles to navigate around. The woman stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign language. Her eyes were brown, dark, and deep-set, and there were circles under them that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She looked at him with the particular suspicion of someone who had learned that kindness usually came with a price. Thomas gestured toward the booth in the corner, toward the empty seat across from where his plate sat, growing cold. "Come sit down." "We can't." The woman's hand tightened on her son's shoulder. "We don't want to bother you." "You're not." Thomas looked at the boy, and the boy looked back at him, and for a moment they existed in a space outside of time, two strangers meeting across a divide of age and circumstance. The boy's eyes moved to the second plate of food on the table, the meatloaf and mashed potatoes that no one was eating, and his expression changed in a way that Thomas recognized. Longing. The desperate, painful longing of someone who needed something they could not ask for. "Please," Thomas said, and the word came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by 3 years of disuse. The woman hesitated for a long moment. Her eyes moved from Thomas to the booth to her son and back again, calculating something, weighing something. Then she nodded just once and guided the boy toward the corner of the diner. They slid into the booth, mother and son together on the same side, pressed close, as though there might be safety in their proximity. The boy's eyes never left the plate of food. He stared at it the way a man dying of thirst might stare at water, with a need so profound it transcended politeness. Thomas pushed the plate toward them. "Eat." The boy looked up at his mother. She nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his shoulder, and the boy picked up the fork and began to eat. He ate fast, desperately shoveling food into his mouth without pausing to chew properly. The mashed potatoes disappeared in seconds, and he attacked the meatloaf with a ferocity that spoke of too many missed meals. Gravy dripped down his chin, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, never stopping, never slowing, as though he expected the food to vanish if he did not consume it quickly enough. Thomas watched, and something shifted in his chest. Not the emptiness he had grown accustomed to. Something else. Something that had edges and weight and heat. The woman sat with her hands in her lap, fingers twisted together, her eyes fixed on the table. She was not eating, she was not moving. She was barely breathing, as though she was trying to make herself as small as possible, to take up as little space as she could manage. "You should eat something too," Thomas said. "I'm not hungry, you're shaking." She looked up at him then, and their eyes met for the first time. Brown meeting gray exhaustion, meeting emptiness. She was younger than he had initially thought, maybe early 30s, but she carried herself like someone much older. Someone who had already lived several lifetimes and was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. "We'll pay you back," she said. "I promise. When I find work." Thomas shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Dorothy appeared beside the table, a glass of water in her hand. She set it down in front of the boy without a word, and her eyes met Thomas's for a moment, something unreadable passing between them. A question, perhaps, or an acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked away back to her post behind the counter where the coffee pots waited. The boy slowed down as the plate emptied, his desperate hunger giving way to something closer to normal eating. When he finally set down his fork, the plate was clean scraped so thoroughly it looked like it had been washed. He looked up at Thomas with eyes that were slightly less haunted than they had been when he walked in. "Thank you." The boy's voice was small and quiet, the voice of a child who had learned to keep himself small and quiet. Thomas felt his throat tighten. The voice was high and clear the way Jamie's voice had been, and for a moment he was back in the same booth 3 years ago, watching a different boy devour a different plate of meatloaf, listening to a different voice complain that there was not enough gravy. "You're welcome," Thomas said, and the words came out thick, rough-edged. The woman extended her hand across the table, hesitant, as though she was not sure she had the right to make this gesture. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is my son, Ethan." Thomas nodded, accepting the introduction. Tom Hayes." Sarah tried to smile, but it did not reach her eyes. The expression sat on her face like something borrowed, something she had forgotten how to make genuine. We're not usually like this. Things got hard. We're trying to figure it out." There were stories behind those words, Thomas knew. Stories that could not be told to strangers. Wounds that were too fresh to expose to the cold air of a diner in a strange town. He recognized the careful way she spoke the words she chose and the words she avoided. He had spoken the same way once in the months after Linda died, when people asked how he was doing, and he had to find ways to answer that would not break him. "Where are you staying?" he asked, because it was a practical question, something that could be answered without revealing too much. Sarah's face tightened. Her hand moved to her son's shoulder, protective, automatic. We'll find somewhere." That meant nowhere. Thomas understood the language of people who had run out of options. He had spoken it himself in different ways in the dark nights when the bottle of whiskey sat on the workbench next to the loaded gun, and he had conversations with the empty air about whether there was any point in continuing. Ethan was leaning against his mother's side now, his eyes beginning to close. The food had filled his belly, and the warmth of the diner was doing what warmth does to exhausted children. His small body relaxed against Sarah, and his breathing began to slow, and in a few minutes he would be asleep. Thomas looked at the boy, looked at the way his thin fingers curled against his mother's coat, the way his face softened in approaching sleep, the way he seemed so small and so fragile, and so completely at the mercy of a world that had not been kind to him. He thought about the backpack hanging on the edge of the booth, the blue one with Spider-Man on the front. He thought about the 3 years of Friday nights, the 3 years of 2 plates of food, the 3 years of pretending that if he just kept coming back, kept ordering the second plate, kept touching the strap of the backpack, his son would somehow still be there. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. "I have a shop," Thomas said. "I fix motorcycles. There's a small room in the back. Not much, but it's dry and it's warm. You can stay there tonight." Sarah's eyes went wide. The suggestion seemed to catch her completely off guard, and for a moment she just stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her hands frozen on her son's shoulder. "We couldn't," she said. "It's not charity." Thomas cut her off, but gently, the way you might redirect a child who was walking toward the street. "I just have the space and it's cold out." Sarah looked at him like she was trying to read his mind, to find the catch, the hook, the reason why a stranger would offer something for nothing. Her eyes moved over his face, searching for danger, for hidden motives, for all the things she had learned to watch for. Then she looked at Ethan asleep against her shoulder, and something in her crumbled. "Okay," she whispered. "Just for tonight." Thomas paid the bill, leaving his usual generous tip for Dorothy, and led them out to his truck. A Ford F-150 blue paint faded to almost gray, with dents in the fender and rust spots on the wheel wells. Ethan was half asleep, stumbling on his feet, and Thomas picked him up without thinking about it. The boy was light, too light for a 6-year-old. Thomas could feel the ridge of his spine through his shirt, could count the ribs if he pressed. The boy smelled like rain and unwashed clothes, and something else, something that might have been fear, made physical. But he did not resist being carried. He just tucked his head against Thomas's shoulder and let himself be held, and Thomas felt the weight of him like something precious and terrifying. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove in silence through the empty streets of Millbrook. The town was quiet at this hour. Most of the shops closed, most of the houses dark except for the blue flicker of television screens behind curtained windows. Street lights cast pools of yellow on the pavement, and the truck's headlights carved a path through the darkness ahead. The shop was only 10 minutes from the diner, a squat brick building on the east side of town with a metal garage door and a faded sign that read Hayes Motors. Thomas pulled up to the side entrance, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Inside the shop smelled like oil and metal and old concrete. The familiar scents wrapped around Thomas like a second skin as he led them past the motorcycles in various states of repair, past the tool benches and the air compressor and the lift that his father had installed 30 years ago. The narrow hallway in the back led to a small room that he used for storage and occasional naps when he was working late. The room was not much. A cot with a thin mattress, a space heater that rattled when it ran a pile of blankets that were clean but old, a small sink in the corner, a single window that looked out on the empty lot behind the building. It was cold, but the space heater would fix that. It was Spartan, but it was dry, and it was safe, and it was four walls and a door that locked. Thomas set Ethan down on the cot. The boy did not wake, just curled onto his side and pulled his knees toward his chest, making himself small, in the way children do when they are trying to disappear. Sarah stood in the doorway looking around the room like she still could not quite believe this was happening. Her eyes moved over the bare walls, the industrial sink, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. This was not luxury. This was barely survival. But compared to wherever she had been before, it might as well have been a palace. Why, she asked, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. Why are you doing this? Thomas did not know how to answer. He looked at the boy on the cot, at the way his small chest rose and fell, with each breath, at the way his fingers twitched in his sleep. Because someone should, he said finally, and because I can. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tight with the effort of holding herself together. I will pay you back. Her voice was stronger now, something fierce underneath the exhaustion. I don't know how, but I will. Thomas nodded, accepting this without argument. You don't have to. He turned to leave, but Sarah spoke again, and her words stopped him at the door. What happened to you? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Thomas did not turn around. He stood with his hand on the doorframe, looking at the hallway ahead, at the shadows cast by the single bare bulb. The same thing that happens to everyone eventually, he said. The world took something from me, and I never figured out how to get it back. He walked out before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the silence, and then he went upstairs to his apartment, where the bottle of whiskey waited and the empty rooms echoed with ghosts. Sleep did not come easily that night. Thomas lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building settling around him. Somewhere below, in the small room behind the garage, a woman and her son were sleeping in his space, using his blankets, breathing his air. He thought about Linda, about the way she used to tuck Jamie in at night, singing softly, her red hair falling over her shoulder like a curtain of fire. He thought about the hospital room where she had spent her last weeks, the way her hand had felt in his, so small and so cold. He thought about her last words whispered in the gray light of a winter morning when the machines had started to fail. Take care of our boy. Don't let the sadness eat you alive. He had tried. God help him, he had tried. For 2 years after Linda died, he had poured everything he had into Jamie. He had learned to cook simple meals to help with homework, to braid hair for school plays when Jamie's female classmates taught him how. He had shown up to every parent-teacher conference, every Little League game, every school event that Jamie participated in. He had been both mother and father, inadequate at both, but trying, always trying. And then the intersection, the red light, the pickup truck. Thomas closed his eyes, but the images came anyway. The crunch of metal, the shattering of glass, the way the world had spun around him as the car rolled. Waking up in the hospital 3 days later, his body broken in a dozen places, and the first question out of his mouth being about his son. The look on the doctor's face, the words that followed. We did everything we could. I'm so sorry. He didn't suffer. He didn't suffer. As if that made it better. As if a quick death was somehow a mercy when the alternative was a lifetime of watching your child grow up. Thomas opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. The water stain in the corner had gotten bigger. He should probably do something about that. He should probably do something about a lot of things, but not tonight. Tonight he would lie here and he would remember, and he would wait for morning to come so he could get up and do it all again. Morning arrived gray and cold, the light filtering through the window, like something tired and reluctant. Thomas rose before dawn, a habit that had started when Jamie was a baby and never quite stopped. He made coffee in the small kitchen, drank it black and bitter, and tried to convince himself that today would be different from yesterday. When he went down to the shop, Sarah was already awake. He found her on her hands and knees in the garage, scrubbing at the oil stains on the concrete floor with a rag and a bucket of soapy water. Her hands were red and raw from the cold water and the harsh soap, but she did not stop when she heard him come in. She just kept scrubbing her jaw, set with determination. "You don't have to do that," Thomas said. Sarah looked up, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had not slept much. "I need to do something. You've already done too much." Ethan was still asleep in the back room. Thomas could see him through the doorway, curled under the pile of blankets, his face peaceful in a way it had not been the night before. "You looking for work?" Thomas asked. Sarah stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'll take anything." Thomas made a call. Dorothy had been complaining for months about needing help in the kitchen, someone to wash dishes and prep vegetables and do the 100 small tasks that kept a diner running. The pay was not much, but it was something. Dorothy said yes without hesitation. There was something in her voice that Thomas recognized, the particular warmth of someone who had been helped once and never forgot the debt. Sarah would start the next day. "Just until I get back on my feet," Sarah said when Thomas told her. A week, maybe two. But a week became two, and two became a month, and Sarah and Ethan became part of the rhythm of Thomas's life in ways he had not expected. Ethan would sit in the corner of the shop after school doing homework on an overturned crate while Thomas worked on engines. The boy was quiet at first, watching with wide eyes as Thomas disassembled carburetors and replaced spark plugs and performed the 100 small surgeries that kept machines alive. He did not ask questions, did not speak unless spoken to, and Thomas understood that this was the behavior of a child who had learned that silence was safety. But slowly, as the days passed and nothing bad happened, Ethan began to open up. The questions started small, hesitant, offered like gifts that might be refused. "What's that thing?" "It's a carburetor. It mixes fuel and air so the engine can run." "How does it work?" Thomas found himself explaining drawing diagrams on scraps of paper, showing Ethan the components laid out on the workbench. The boy absorbed information like a sponge, asking follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening, actually thinking. "Why do motorcycles need oil? How do the gears work? What makes them go fast?" Thomas answered them all, surprised at how easy it was to talk to a child again. The words came out rusty at first, unused muscles being forced back into motion, but they came, and with them came memories. Jamie asking the same questions. Jamie sitting on the same workbench, watching with the same wide eyes. "It's like a spinning top," Thomas said one afternoon, explaining how a motorcycle stayed upright. "When the wheels turn fast enough, they want to stay balanced. That's why you can't ride a motorcycle standing still. You have to keep moving." Ethan nodded, his forehead wrinkled in concentration. "Like sharks. My teacher said sharks have to keep swimming or they die." Thomas looked at the pro, at his earnest face and his too thin frame, and felt something crack open in his chest. "Yeah, like sharks." Sarah worked long hours at the diner, but she always came back to the shop at night. She would bring leftovers from the kitchen, containers of soup and half-eaten pies and bread that was a day too old to sell but still perfectly good to eat. They would sit in the back room, the three of them, and eat together, and Thomas would listen to Ethan talk about school and Sarah talk about her day, and he would feel something that he had not felt in 3 years. It felt like a routine, like a life. But the neighbors noticed. Mrs. Ruth Henderson was the first to say something. She lived in the apartment building next to the shop, a 68-year-old widow with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She had been watching Thomas for years, ever since the accident, with the particular attention of someone who made other people's business her own. She cornered him one afternoon while he was carrying groceries from his truck, blocking his path with her small body and her large personality. "I don't mean to pry," her tone suggested otherwise, "but that woman and her boy, they've been here a while now, haven't they?" Thomas shifted the grocery bag in his arms, feeling the weight of the canned goods pressing against his chest. They needed a place to stay. Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line, the expression of someone who had already made up her mind and was simply looking for confirmation. "People talk, Thomas. A widower and a woman who's clearly running from something. It doesn't look right. I'm not worried about how it looks." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes moving over his face like she was looking for cracks. Well, I just thought you should know what people are saying. She walked away, but her words stayed behind, lingering in the air like exhaust fumes. That night, Thomas sat in the diner alone. Sarah was working the late shift in the kitchen, and Ethan was asleep in the back room at the shop. Dorothy slid into the booth across from him, something she rarely did, and fixed him with a look that was equal parts concern and warning. I like her. Dorothy nodded toward the kitchen, where Sarah was visible through the pass-through window, scrubbing pots with the same fierce determination she had shown scrubbing the garage floor. She works hard, doesn't complain. And the boy, he has his mother's eyes, sweet kid. But Thomas heard the word coming before Dorothy said it. But you need to be careful. Dorothy lowered her voice, leaning across the table. People are saying things about you two, about why she's staying with you. I don't care what people say. You should. Dorothy's eyes were kind, but her voice was firm. Some folks think you're being taken advantage of. Others think you're taking advantage. Either way, it's not going to end well if you're not careful, Thomas wanted to argue. He wanted to say that what he did in his own shop was his own business, that the opinions of small-minded people in a small-minded town did not matter. But Dorothy had been his mother's friend, had known him since he was a boy, and her words carried a weight that others did not. And besides, late at night when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he had started asking himself the same questions. Was he helping Sarah because it was the right thing to do? Or was he using her and Ethan to fill the hole his son had left behind? Was this kindness, or was it something more selfish, some attempt to recreate what he had lost, to play act at being a father again with someone else's child? He did not have an answer. Maybe there was no answer. Maybe human motivations were always mixed, always complicated, always more than one thing at once. Think about it. Dorothy stood up, patted his shoulder, and went back to her counter. Thomas stared at his coffee, watching the steam rise and dissipate. The liquid was going cold, but he did not drink it. He just sat there alone in his corner booth, wondering if he was saving Sarah and Ethan, or if they were saving him, and whether it mattered which one was true. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Sarah and Ethan did not leave. The room behind the garage became a home of sorts. Sarah hung curtains on the small window, brought in a rug to cover the cold concrete floor, found a small table at a yard sale where Ethan could do his homework. The space was still cramped, still far from luxurious, but it had warmth now, both literal and metaphorical. Thomas found himself adjusting his routines around them. He started making breakfast for 3 instead of 1, nothing fancy, just eggs and toast and coffee for the adults, orange juice for the boy. He learned which cereal Ethan preferred, which subjects he struggled with in school, which cartoons he liked to watch on the small television that Thomas dragged down from his apartment. Sarah began to relax slowly, like a clenched fist gradually uncurling. The wariness never entirely left her eyes, but it softened, became something more manageable. She smiled more often, genuine smiles that reached her eyes, and Thomas realized that he had forgotten what that looked like. A woman smiling in his presence without pity or caution. They did not talk about the past, not yet. There was an unspoken agreement between them, an understanding that some stories were too heavy to share before trust was fully established. Thomas did not ask about Ethan's father, about the reason they were running, about the fear that still flickered in Sarah's eyes when a car backfired or a door slammed too loudly. And Sarah did not ask about the backpack. She had noticed it, of course. The blue Spider-Man backpack that hung on the edge of the booth every Friday night that Thomas carried with him when they went to the diner that he sometimes held in his hands late at night when he thought no one was watching. She looked at it with the particular understanding of someone who recognized grief, but she did not ask. Maybe she was waiting for him to tell her. Or maybe she knew that some things could only be shared when the person was ready. The 5th week brought the first real conversation. It was early morning before Ethan woke up and Thomas found Sarah in the garage again. She was not scrubbing this time. She was just standing there looking at the motorcycles, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Thomas handed her a cup of coffee and she took it without speaking. They stood side by side in the gray light, watching the shadows slowly brighten. I had a daughter. Sarah's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Before Ethan, her name was Emma. Thomas did not respond. He just waited, giving her space to continue. She was born too early, 28 weeks. She lived for 3 days. The words hung in the cold air, fragile as ice crystals. After she died, my husband blamed me, said it was my fault, said I didn't take care of myself, didn't rest enough, worked too hard. Sarah's voice was flat, reciting facts rather than emotions. He started drinking. Then he started hitting. I stayed for 2 years because I didn't know where else to go. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The anger came slowly building like water behind a dam, but he kept his face neutral. He understood that this was not the time for his emotions. One night he hit Ethan. Sarah's voice cracked on her son's name. And I knew we had to leave, so you ran. Sarah nodded. We went to Indiana first, then here. I don't know why I stopped in Millbrook. It just felt far enough. Is he looking for you? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. Ryan doesn't give up. He thinks Ethan belongs to him. He thinks I belong to him. He'll find us eventually. Thomas looked at the motorcycle. He had been working on a vintage Harley that needed a new transmission. His hands wanted to be doing something, anything, but he kept them still. You're safe here, he said, at least for now. Sarah turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that he could not quite identify. Gratitude, maybe, or something more complicated. Why are you helping us, Tom? Really, nobody just helps people like this, not without wanting something. The question was the same one she had asked the first night, but it carried more weight now. They knew each other better. The question demanded a real answer. Thomas looked at the backpack hanging on the hook by the door. He had brought it with him this morning without thinking, a habit so ingrained he barely noticed it anymore. Because I lost someone too, he said, and I know what it feels like when the world forgets about you. Sarah followed his gaze to the backpack, and understanding dawned in her eyes. She did not ask for details. She did not need to. They stood in silence as the sun finished rising, and somewhere in the back room Ethan stirred and began to wake. The town continued to watch. Thomas noticed it in small ways. The glances that lingered a moment too long. The conversations that stopped when he walked into a room. The way certain customers at the shop seemed to find excuses to come by more often, their eyes wandering toward the back room, where they knew Sarah and Ethan were living. One of his regulars, a man named Pete, who brought his vintage Indian motorcycle in for tuning every few months, was the first to say something directly. Heard you got a woman and kids staying with you. Pete's voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Taking in strays now, Tom. Just helping someone out. Pete nodded slowly, turning a wrench in his hands. People are talking, saying she's using you. Pretty young thing like that, single guy with a business. She's not using me, if you say so. Pete set the wrench down. I'm just saying, be careful. A lot of folks in this town remember what you went through. They don't want to see you get hurt again. Thomas understood what Pete was really saying. He understood that the concern was genuine, even if the expression of it was clumsy. People in Millbrook had watched him collapse after Jamie's death. They had watched him withdraw from the world, become a ghost in his own life. They were worried that he was setting himself up for another fall. He appreciated the concern. He just wished they would express it by minding their own business. The worst of it came from Mrs. Henderson, of course. She had taken it upon herself to become the unofficial guardian of Thomas's reputation, which meant spreading rumors while pretending to be fighting against them. I'm not one to gossip, she would say to anyone who would listen, but have you seen the way he looks at her? And that boy, he's calling him uncle now. It's just not natural, a man his age taking in a strange woman with a child. There must be something going on. Sarah heard about the rumors eventually. Thomas saw it in her face when she came home from work one evening, the way her jaw was tight and her eyes were red-rimmed. They're saying things about you, about us. Her voice was quiet, but there was anger underneath it. At the diner, some of the customers, I know. You should ask us to leave. Sarah crossed her arms, a defensive gesture. We're making your life harder. You don't need this. Thomas put down the crescent wrench he had been holding, giving her his full attention. Is that what you want? To leave? No. The word came out quickly, almost involuntarily. But I don't want to ruin your life either. You've done so much for us. If people are going to talk, let them talk. Sarah stared at him. It's not that simple. It is. Thomas turned back to the motorcycle, picking up the wrench again. Small towns always talk. It's what they do. If they weren't talking about you, they'd be talking about someone else. The only question is whether you let it change what you do. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she let out a breath, something that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who wanted something from me. Someone with an angle." Thomas tightened a bolt, feeling the metal yield under his hands. "Everyone has an angle. Mine is just more honest than most." "What's your angle?" He stopped working, looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived, he told her the truth. "My son would have been 10 years old this year. He died 3 years ago, and every day since then I've been trying to figure out how to keep living in a world where he doesn't exist. When you and Ethan walked into that diner, I saw a chance to matter to someone again. To be useful. To feel like I was doing something other than waiting to die." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "I didn't give you a place to stay out of charity," Thomas continued. "I did it because I needed you as much as you needed me. Maybe more." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then Sarah crossed the distance, wrapped her arms around him, and held on. It was not romantic. It was not about desire or attraction or any of the things the town's gossips were whispering about. It was simply two broken people recognizing each other. Two survivors finding a moment of connection in a world that had tried to destroy them both. They stood like that for a long time in the cold garage with the smell of oil and metal around them, and neither of them spoke. The weeks continued to pass. October became November, and the cold settled in for its long stay. Thomas found himself changing in ways he did not entirely understand. He smiled more often. He ate proper meals instead of whatever was convenient. He started sleeping through the night, something he had not done consistently since the accident. Ethan had started calling him Uncle Tom, a name that had begun as a joke but had stuck. The boy would run to him after school, backpack bouncing full of stories about his day. He would sit on the workbench and chatter while Thomas worked, filling the silence with questions and observations and the endless stream of consciousness that characterized children everywhere. "You know what I learned today, Uncle Tom? I learned that octopuses have 3 hearts. 3. Can you believe it? Why do they need 3 hearts? Do motorcycles have hearts? What's the engine like a heart?" Thomas would answer as best he could, often making things up when he did not know, and Ethan would nod seriously as though receiving wisdom from an oracle. Sarah noticed the changes. She mentioned it one evening when Ethan was already asleep and they were sitting in the small room with cups of tea that had long since gone cold. "You're different than when we first met." Thomas considered this. "Different how?" "You laughed today. When Ethan told that joke about the elephant, you actually laughed it." He thought about it. He had laughed, hadn't he? A real laugh, not the hollow performance he had been giving for 3 years. The sound had surprised him when it came out unfamiliar in his own throat. "I guess I did." Sarah reached across the small table, placed her hand on his. It was a simple gesture, uncomplicated. "When we first came here, I was afraid of you. Did you know that?" "Afraid. Not of you specifically. Of what you might want. Of what I might have to give to keep us safe." Her fingers tightened on his. "But you never asked for anything. You just helped. That's what you do," Thomas said. "When someone needs help." "No," Sarah shook her head. "That's what good people do. And there aren't as many of those as you might think." They sat in comfortable silence, and Thomas thought about his father. About the way the old man had built this shop from nothing, working 18-hour days until his hands were cracked and bleeding, all so his son could have something to inherit. About the way he had died in the same building, a heart attack at 62, gone before Thomas could say goodbye. "Hayes men don't quit," his father used to say. "We get knocked down, we get back up. It's what we do." Thomas had gotten knocked down, lower than he had ever thought possible. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to get back up. November 20th arrived cold and gray, with clouds that promised snow, but had not yet delivered. Thomas woke early as he always did, but he did not get out of bed immediately. He lay there looking at the ceiling, thinking about the date. Jamie's birthday. His son would have been 10 years old today. Double digits, a milestone that most parents took for granted, just another step on the long journey of raising a child. But for Thomas, it was a milestone that would never be reached, a birthday that would never be celebrated. He could feel the grief rising, the familiar weight pressing down on his chest. It had not gotten lighter over the years, just more predictable. He knew it would come on certain days, at certain moments, and he had learned to brace himself for it, the way you brace yourself for a blow. He got up, got dressed, made coffee. The routine helped. Movement helped. Anything was better than lying still and letting the thoughts consume him. Sarah noticed immediately. She was in the kitchen when he came down making breakfast for Ethan, and her eyes moved over his face with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read pain. "You okay?" Thomas considered lying. It would have been easy. "I'm fine, just tired." But Sarah had shared her truth with him, and it felt wrong to repay that with a lie. "Today's a hard day," Sarah nodded, accepting this without pressing for details. "Is there anything I can do?" "No, but thank you." Ethan came bounding in, full of the limitless energy of childhood, and the conversation ended. The boy demanded pancakes, and Thomas made them, focusing on the simple task of measuring and mixing and pouring, letting the routine carry him through the morning. But the weight did not lift. It stayed with him throughout the day, a presence at his shoulder, a heaviness in his chest. He worked on motorcycles, answered phone calls, interacted with customers, but everything felt muted, like he was experiencing the world through a layer of glass. At 7 o'clock, he went to the diner. Sarah offered to come with him, but he shook his head. This was something he needed to do alone. She understood the way she seemed to understand most things, and she did not push. Dorothy had the plates ready when he walked in, 2 servings of meatloaf and mashed potatoes just like every Friday night. She set them down without a word, her eyes meeting his for a moment, and he saw the understanding there. She knew what today was. She had known Jamie had watched the boy grow from an infant to a toddler to a child. She had served him his first plate of meatloaf, had laughed at his jokes, had given him extra gravy when his father was not looking. She did not say happy birthday. There was nothing happy about this birthday. She just touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity, and walked away. Thomas sat in the booth looking at the 2 plates and felt the weight of 3 years pressing down on him. The backpack hung on its hook, blue and faded. Thomas reached out and touched the strap, running his fingers over the fabric that his son had touched 1,000 times. "Happy birthday, buddy," he whispered. "I miss you." The plate across from him sat untouched, the meatloaf growing cold, the gravy developing its skin. It was a plate for a ghost, an offering to someone who would never eat it. But tonight, for some reason, it felt different. The emptiness was still there. The grief was still there, but there was something else too. Something that had not been there before. Thomas thought about Ethan, about the way the boy laughed, the way he asked questions, the way he had started to fill some of the silence in Thomas's life. He thought about Sarah, about the strength it took to run from everything you knew, to start over in a strange town with nothing but your child and your determination. He was not replacing Jamie. He knew that. Nothing could replace Jamie. The boy he had lost would always be lost, would always be the empty plate at the table, the backpack on the hook, the birthday that would never be celebrated. But maybe that was not the only story. Maybe there was room for another story running alongside the first one. A story about helping someone else, about finding purpose in something outside of grief, about learning to live again, not despite the loss, but with it. Thomas ate his meal slowly, methodically. When he was finished, he did something he had never done before. He ate the second plate too. The meatloaf was cold by then, the potatoes congealed, but he ate every bite. It felt like something, though he could not have said what. An acknowledgement maybe, a letting go. Or perhaps just a recognition that wasted food helped no one, living or dead. When Dorothy came to collect the empty plates, she stopped short. She looked at the table, at the 2 clean plates, at Thomas. "Well," her voice was soft. "That's new." Thomas nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. Dorothy collected the plates, stacked them on her arm, and paused before walking away. "Jamie would be proud of you," she said, "for helping that woman and her boy. He had a good heart, just like his father." Then she was gone, and Thomas was alone with the empty table and the backpack and the weight of everything he had lost. But the weight felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but more bearable. Like he had finally figured out the right way to carry it. He left a larger tip than usual and walked out into the cold November night. The shop was quiet when he returned. Sarah was reading in the small room, and Ethan was asleep, his small face peaceful in the dim light. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. 2 people he had not known 2 months ago, now inexplicably at the center of his life. 2 refugees from a storm he did not fully understand, sheltering in the space he had built. Sarah looked up from her book, saw him standing there and smiled. How was the diner? Different. Thomas stepped into the room, sat down in the chair across from her. Good different, I think. Sarah marked her place in the book and set it aside. Want to talk about it? Thomas thought about everything he could say. About Jamie, about the birthday, about the 2 plates of meatloaf, about the way grief worked, the way it never really went away, but sometimes made room for other things. Not tonight, he said, but soon. I'll tell you everything soon. Sarah nodded, accepting this. Take your time. They sat in comfortable silence, and somewhere outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. The snow continued through the night, blanketing Millbrook in white. By morning, the world looked different, clean and bright and new. Thomas woke to the sound of Ethan's laughter. The boy was outside in the parking lot making snow angels, his voice carrying through the cold air like bells. Uncle Tom, look at me. Thomas stood at the window watching. Sarah was out there too, wrapped in a coat that was still too big for her breath making clouds in the frozen air. She was smiling, really smiling, and she looked young in a way she usually did not. For a moment, standing at that window, Thomas felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Hope. It was a fragile thing, tentative like the first green shoots pushing through snow in early spring. He knew better than to trust it completely. He knew that hope could be cruel, could set you up for falls that left you lower than before. But he felt it anyway, and that had to count for something. He went outside to join them. The 3 of them spent the morning playing in the snow. Thomas showed Ethan how to pack snowballs properly, how to build the base of a snowman, how to make the snow squeak underfoot by stepping just right. The boy was delighted by everything, finding wonder in the simplest details. Did you know Ethan said, packing snow between his mittened hands, that no 2 snowflakes are exactly the same? That's what my teacher said. Every single one is different. That's right. So that means this snowball is totally unique. Nobody has ever made this exact snowball before. Thomas laughed and the sound surprised him again. I guess that's true. Cool. Ethan grinned and threw the snowball at his mother. The day continued like that, simple and good. They built a lopsided snowman with stones for eyes and a carrot for a nose. They drank hot chocolate in the small room, warming their hands on the mugs. They watched the afternoon light fade into evening, and it felt like something Thomas had forgotten existed. A normal day, a happy day. He knew it could not last forever. He knew that Ryan was still out there somewhere, that Sarah's past had not disappeared just because she had run from it. He knew that the town's whispers had not stopped, that Mrs. Henderson was probably watching from her window right now, adding this scene to her catalog of suspicions. But for today, none of that mattered. For today, there was snow and laughter and 3 people who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. It was enough. It had to be enough. The call came that evening. Thomas was alone in the garage working on the Harley when his phone buzzed. The screen showed an unknown number, which usually meant telemarketer. He almost did not answer, but something made him pick up. Silence on the other end, then heavy breathing, the sound of someone deciding whether to speak. Thomas's hand tightened on the phone. Hello? Is she there? A man's voice, low and rough. My wife, is she there? The cold that went through Thomas had nothing to do with the weather. He knew without being told exactly who this was. I think you have the wrong number. A laugh, harsh and humorless. Don't play games with me. I know she's there. I know everything. Sarah Patterson, my son Ethan. Someone told me they're staying with some mechanic in a hick town in Ohio. Thomas's mind raced. How? How had he found them? Sarah had been so careful, had paid cash for everything, had not used credit cards, or given her real name. How? I don't know what you're talking about. Another laugh. Sure you don't. Look, I'm going to make this simple. She's my wife. He's my son. They belong to me, and I'm coming to get what's mine. The line went dead. Thomas stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The garage suddenly felt very cold, and the snow falling outside the window looked less like magic and more like a curtain hiding whatever was approaching. He walked to the back room. Sarah was sitting on the bed reading to Ethan, her voice soft and melodic. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her face changed when she saw his expression. What's wrong? Thomas closed the door behind him. Ethan looked up from the book, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, his small face suddenly wary. Ethan, Thomas said, keeping his voice calm, can you go get your coloring book from the main room? I need to talk to your mom for a minute. The boy looked at his mother, who nodded. He slid off the bed and slipped past Thomas, and when he was gone, Thomas closed the door again. He called Thomas, said, "Ryan, he knows you're here." The color drained from Sarah's face. She stood up, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with the fear that he had not seen since the first night she walked into the diner. "How? I don't know, but he said he's coming." Sarah's legs gave out. She sat back down on the bed, her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body trembling. Thomas sat beside her, not touching, just present. "We have to run." Her voice was muffled by her hands. "We have to leave tonight." "And go where?" Thomas kept his voice level, though his own heart was racing. "He'll follow. He'll find you again. You can't run forever. What else can we do?" Thomas thought about the shop, about the cameras he had never bothered to install, about the locks that were standard residential grade, easily broken, about the fact that he was a mechanic, not a soldier, and that Ryan Mitchell had spent years in Afghanistan learning how to kill. But he also thought about something else, about Dorothy and Mrs. Henderson and Frank the police chief, and all the other people in this small town who might talk behind his back, but would also close ranks against an outsider. About the fact that running meant Sarah and Ethan would always be running, always looking over their shoulders, never safe. "You stay," he said. "We figure this out together. You don't understand." Sarah looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "Ryan is dangerous. He was in the military. He's killed people. You're just a mechanic, I know." Thomas reached out, took her hand. "But I'm also not going to let him hurt you. Either of you. He could be here tomorrow. He could. Then we have tonight to prepare." They sat in silence, holding hands, while outside the snow continued to fall. Somewhere out there, a storm was coming. But for now, they were together, and that was something. The door creaked open, and Ethan appeared, clutching his coloring book to his chest. His eyes moved between his mother and Thomas, reading the tension in the room. "Is the bad man coming?" His voice was small, but barely a whisper. Sarah opened her arms, and Ethan ran to her, burying his face in her chest. She held him tightly, rocking him gently, and over his head, her eyes met Thomas's. There was fear in those eyes, but there was also something else, something that looked like trust. "It's going to be okay," Thomas said, though he was not sure he believed it. "I promise." It was a promise he did not know if he could keep. But he made it anyway, because that was what you did. You made promises. You tried to keep them. And when the storm came, you stood your ground and hoped you were strong enough to survive. The snow fell harder, covering the world in white, hiding everything that lay beneath. And in the distance, somewhere in the darkness, headlights turned onto the highway that led to Millbrook. Word count 9, 847, part 1 of 3. Status continuing. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching like taffy. Thomas did not sleep. He sat in the main room of the shop with the lights dimmed, watching the parking lot through the window, waiting for headlights that did not come. He had made what preparations he could. The locks on all doors had been checked and reinforced with heavy-duty deadbolts he had found in the storage closet. He had positioned his heaviest tools near the entrances, not as weapons exactly, but as options. A tire iron by the front door, a crowbar by the back. The shotgun his father had left him was loaded and leaning against the wall behind his chair, its presence both comforting and terrifying. Sarah had wanted to call the police, but Thomas had talked her out of it. "What would you tell them?" he had asked. "That your ex-husband called and said he was coming. That's not a crime. They won't do anything until he does something." And by then, he had not finished the sentence. He had not needed to. So they waited. Sarah lay with Ethan in the back room, her body curled around her son's, her eyes wide open in the darkness. Thomas sat in his chair, watching, listening, preparing for something he hoped would not come. Dawn arrived, gray and anticlimactic. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving behind a world coated in white. The parking lot was empty. No strange cars, no threatening figures. Just the quiet stillness of a small town on a winter morning. Thomas made coffee, the act of grinding beans and pouring water and waiting for the drip feeling almost absurd in its normalcy. He brought a cup to Sarah, who had finally dozed off, Ethan still clutched in her arms. She woke when she smelled the coffee, blinking up at him with eyes that held the residue of nightmares. "Nothing happened," Thomas said. "He didn't show up. Yet." Sarah sat up carefully, trying not to wake Ethan. "He didn't show up yet. Maybe he won't." But they both knew that was wishful thinking. Ryan Mitchell had called. He had made a promise. Men like him kept their promises, especially the dark ones. The day passed in a state of suspended animation. Thomas went through the motions of working, but his attention was always on the door on the parking lot, on the road that led into town. Every car that passed made his shoulders tense. Every customer who walked in made his hand drift toward the tire iron. Sarah kept Ethan home from school. She claimed he was sick, a white lie that felt necessary under the circumstances. The boy seemed to understand that something was wrong, asking fewer questions than usual, staying close to his mother, finding quiet ways to occupy himself. By late afternoon, the tension had become almost unbearable. Thomas found himself snapping at customers, making mistakes on simple repairs, losing track of conversations mid-sentence. The waiting was worse than any confrontation could be. At 5 o'clock, the door of the shop opened. Thomas's hand moved to the tire iron before he recognized the figure in the doorway. Not Ryan. Not yet. Just Dorothy, wrapped in a heavy coat, her face creased with concern. I heard what happened. She stepped inside, closing the door against the cold. The whole town's talking about it. Of course they are. Thomas set down the wrench he had been holding. What are they saying? That Sarah's husband called? That he's coming for her? Dorothy moved closer, lowering her voice even though they were alone. Frank called me, asked if I knew anything. He's worried. Frank, as in the police chief Frank, Dorothy nodded. He's got a nephew who served with Ryan Mitchell. Said the man came back from Afghanistan different. Said he saw things over there, did things, said he's dangerous. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. We know he's dangerous. What I'm saying is Frank's taking this seriously. He can't do anything officially until Ryan actually breaks the law, but he's going to have patrol cars swing by more often. Keep an eye out. It was something. Not much, but something. Dorothy stayed for a while, sitting with Sarah and Ethan, bringing a sense of normalcy that the day had been lacking. She told stories about the diner, about customers who had come and gone over the years, about the time a man tried to pay his bill with a live chicken. Ethan laughed at that one, the sound breaking through the tension like sunlight through clouds. When she left, she pressed Thomas's hand and looked into his eyes with an intensity that surprised him. Hayes men don't quit, she said. Your father used to say that, and neither do you. You knew my father. Everyone knew your father. He was a good man, stubborn as a mule, but good. Dorothy released his hand. You're a good man too, Tom. Whatever happens, remember that. She walked out into the cold, leaving Thomas standing in the doorway, watching her car disappear down the street. Night fell again, and the watching resumed. Thomas had moved a cot into the main room, positioning it where he could see both the front and back doors. He did not expect to sleep, but having the option felt necessary. Sarah had offered to take a shift, but he had refused. This was his shop, his responsibility. If Ryan came, he would be the first line of defense. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock, 2. At 3 in the morning, Thomas heard something. It was subtle, the kind of sound you might miss if you were not listening for it. A crunch of snow, a footstep, someone moving outside the building trying to be quiet. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, the shotgun in his hands. He moved to the window, staying low, peering out through the gap between the blinds. A shadow moved in the parking lot, man-sized, heading toward the back of the building. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He crossed the room, silently positioning himself by the back door, the shotgun raised. His hands were steadier than he would have expected. Adrenaline had a way of focusing you, stripping away everything that did not matter. The doorknob jiggled, someone testing the lock. Then nothing. Silence. The shadow retreating footsteps fading into the night. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, waiting for the return. It did not come. Eventually he lowered the shotgun, his arms aching from holding it raised for so long. He had been here. Ryan had been here testing the defenses, learning the layout. He had not come in, but he had let them know he could. A message, a promise of what was to come. Thomas did not sleep at all that night. When dawn came, he made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and he did not tell Sarah what had happened. Not yet. Not until he had a plan. The days that followed took on a rhythm of fear and waiting. Thomas contacted a security company about installing cameras, but they could not come until the following week. He bought motion sensor lights from the hardware store and installed them himself, positioning them to cover all the approaches to the building. He reinforced the back door with a steel plate, adding another deadbolt, making it as secure as he could manage with the tools available. Sarah wanted to leave. She brought it up every day, sometimes multiple times, her voice getting more desperate each time. We should go. We should just drive. Get as far away as possible. Thomas talked her down each time, though his arguments were wearing thin. Running means running forever. We have resources here. People who will help. What people? The people who gossip about us. The people who think I'm using you. Thomas had no answer for that, but he knew one thing for certain: if they ran, Ryan would follow. The man had tracked them from Michigan to Indiana to Ohio. He would track them wherever they went. The only way to stop running was to stop running. Ethan was suffering the most. The boy had retreated into himself, the progress of the past months evaporating in the face of the new fear. He flinched at loud noises, had nightmares every night, and had stopped asking his endless questions. He sat in the corner of the shop, silent and watchful, his eyes constantly moving to the door. It broke Thomas's heart to see it. This was what Ryan Mitchell had done was doing. Not just the violence, but the fear. The constant, grinding terror that poisoned everything it touched. One afternoon, Ethan came to Thomas while he was working on a motorcycle. The boy stood at a distance, uncertain, his hands twisting together. "Uncle Tom." His voice was barely a whisper. Thomas set down his wrench, giving the boy his full attention. "What's up, buddy? Is my dad going to hurt you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Thomas considered lying, considered offering false comfort. But children knew when you were lying. They always knew. "I don't know," Thomas said honestly, "but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure nobody gets hurt." Ethan nodded slowly, processing this. "I don't want him to hurt you, or Mom, or me. I know, he used to be nice." Ethan's eyes were fixed on the floor. "Before, he used to take me to the park. He used to play catch." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "People change, buddy. Sometimes for reasons that don't make sense. But that doesn't mean it's your fault. Mom says the war changed him." "Maybe it did." Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "But that doesn't make what he does okay." "Nothing makes that okay." Ethan looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. "I miss the dad he used to be." Thomas knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "That's allowed," he said. "You're allowed to miss him. You're allowed to love him and be scared of him at the same time. Feelings don't have to make sense." The boy threw himself forward, wrapping his arms around Thomas's neck, burying his face in his shoulder. Thomas held him, feeling the small body shake with sobs, and for a moment, just a moment, he was holding Jamie again. The memory came unbidden, sharp and painful. Jamie after a nightmare clinging to him in the dark. Jamie after a fall from his bike, crying into his shirt. Jamie, Jamie always, Jamie the ghost that never left. But this was not Jamie. This was Ethan, alive and frightened, and desperately in need of comfort. And Thomas could not change the past, could not bring back what he had lost, but he could do this. He could hold this boy and tell him it would be okay, whether it was true or not. "It's gonna be okay," Thomas said, his voice rough. "I've got you. I've got you." They stayed like that for a long time, man and boy, holding on to each other, while the world waited to fall apart. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon. Thomas was alone in the shop working on a routine oil change when the front door banged open. He looked up, and there he was. Ryan Mitchell was tall, 6'2" or 6'3", with the broad shoulders and rigid posture of a military man. His hair was cut short, almost shaved, and there was a scar running from his temple to just above his ear, pale against his weathered skin. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a heavy jacket, but he carried himself like he was still in uniform, like the world was still a combat zone. His eyes were the worst part, pale blue, almost gray, with a flatness that Thomas recognized. He had seen that look in the mirror for 3 years. The look of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and no longer knew how to feel anything. "You're the mechanic." Ryan's voice was flat, without inflection. He did not phrase it as a question. Thomas stood slowly, his hand drifting toward the wrench on the workbench. Not subtle enough to hide the movement, but not aggressive either. "Can I help you?" Ryan's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "You can tell me where my wife is. I don't know what you're talking about." Ryan took a step forward. His movement was controlled, economical, the kind of movement that came from training. Every step was measured, every action deliberate. "Sarah Mitchell, my wife. She's been staying here. Don't try to deny it. I've been watching." Thomas felt the cold wash through him. Watching. Ryan had been watching. For how long? What had he seen? If she was here, Thomas said carefully, I don't think she'd want to see you. That's not her decision to make. Ryan's voice hardened. She's my wife. Ethan is my son. They belong to me. People don't belong to anyone. Something flickered in Ryan's eyes. Something dangerous. You don't know anything about me. About us. About what we've been through. I know you hit her. Thomas's voice was steady, though his heart was hammering. I know you hit your son. The words landed like a slap. Ryan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Thomas thought the man was going to attack. The air between them crackled with potential violence. Then Ryan laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. She told you that, did she? Ryan shook his head slowly. She always was good at playing the victim. Poor Sarah, so fragile, so helpless. Did she tell you about Emma? About how she killed our daughter? Thomas blinked. What? Emma? Ryan's voice was low and tense. Our first child, born too early, died after 3 days because Sarah couldn't take care of herself, couldn't do the one thing she was supposed to do. That's not. You don't know. The flatness had left Ryan's voice replaced by something raw and bleeding. You don't know what it's like, watching your child die, holding her in your hands while she takes her last breath, and knowing that it didn't have to happen. That if your wife had just rested more stressed, less done what the doctor said. I know what it's like to lose a child. The words came out before Thomas could stop them. Ryan froze, something shifting in his expression. What? Thomas reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photograph worn at the edges from years of handling. Jamie at 6, grinning at the camera, missing 2 front teeth. My son. Thomas held up the photo. Jamie. He died 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light. Ryan stared at the photograph. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Ryan said, I'm sorry. And for that moment, just that moment, he sounded like he meant it. It doesn't excuse what you did. Thomas put the photograph away. Losing a child is hell, I know that. But you can't take that hell and pour it onto other people. You don't understand. I do understand. That's the problem. I understand exactly what you're going through. The guilt, the rage, the feeling like the world has ended and everyone else is just going on like nothing happened. Thomas took a step forward. But I didn't hit anyone. I didn't terrorize my family. I turned it inward. And yeah, I almost destroyed myself. But I didn't destroy anyone else. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. The dangerous tension was back, coiling in the air between them. She's my wife, Ryan said through gritted teeth. He's my son. You have no right to keep them from me. They came to me. Thomas held his ground. They were hungry and scared and had nowhere else to go. I didn't take them. They ran from you. She had no right. She had every right. Thomas's voice rose. You don't get to own people. You don't get to hurt people and expect them to stay. That's not how it works. For a moment, Ryan looked like he might attack. His body was coiled, ready, every muscle tense for violence. Thomas braced himself, knowing he would lose this fight, knowing that Ryan had years of combat training and he had nothing but a wrench and desperation. But the attack did not come. Instead, Ryan took a step back, his hands unclenched. Something in his face shifted, not softening exactly, but retreating behind that flat mask again. This isn't over. His voice was quiet now, controlled. I'll be back. And next time I won't just talk. He turned and walked out, leaving the door swinging open behind him. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. Then he grabbed his phone and called the police. Frank arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by 2 deputies. Thomas told them everything, the phone call, the footsteps in the night, the confrontation. Frank took notes, asked questions, looked increasingly concerned. We can increase patrols, Frank said when Thomas was finished, but I can't arrest him for a conversation. He hasn't broken any laws yet. Yet? I know. Frank's face was grim. But that's how it works. We have to wait for him to make a move. And what if his move is hurting someone? Then you call us immediately and you hope we get there in time. It was not reassuring. It was not meant to be. After the police left, Thomas told Sarah what had happened. He watched her face cycle through emotions, fear, anger, despair, and finally a strange kind of resignation. I should have known. Her voice was flat. Running never works. He always finds me. We're not running. Then what are we doing? Thomas looked at her, at this woman who had walked into his life 2 months ago and somehow become essential to it. At the mother who had sacrificed everything to protect her son. At the survivor who kept getting up no matter how many times the world knocked her down. We're fighting, he said, in whatever way we can. We're not giving up. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why do you care so much? We're nothing to you. Just strangers who showed up one day. Thomas thought about how to answer. He thought about Jamie, about the empty plate at the diner, about the 3 years he had spent waiting to die without having the courage to actually do it. Because you saved me, he said finally. You and Ethan. You walked into that diner and you reminded me that there's still a reason to keep going. That's not nothing. That's everything. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling. They stood like that, two broken people clinging to each other, while outside the window, the last light of day faded into darkness. The weeks that followed were a siege. Ryan did not attack directly, but he made his presence known. His truck would be parked across the street watching. He would show up at the grocery store when Sarah was shopping, standing a few aisles away, not speaking, just watching. He would call the shop at random hours, saying nothing, just breathing into the phone until Thomas hung up. It was psychological warfare, and it was effective. Sarah stopped going out alone. Ethan stopped going to school entirely, his education continuing through books that Thomas bought and lessons that Sarah improvised. The shop's business dropped as word spread about the situation, some customers not wanting to get involved, others actively avoiding the drama. Thomas filed for a restraining order. The process was slow, bureaucratic, full of paperwork and waiting and court dates that stretched into the future. In the meantime, Ryan continued his campaign of terror, always careful to stay just within the bounds of the law. Mrs. Henderson surprisingly became an ally. Whatever her opinions about the propriety of Sarah living at the shop, she had even stronger opinions about men who terrorized women and children. She kept watch from her window, noting every time Ryan's truck appeared, documenting license plates and times and behaviors. She became an unofficial sentry, and her reports to the police added to the growing file. Dorothy brought food from the diner, refused payment, and stayed to talk on the slow afternoons. She had a gift for distraction, for making the hours pass with stories and jokes, and the comfortable presence of someone who genuinely cared. Even Pete, the regular with the Indian motorcycle, offered to help. He knew some guys, he said vaguely, guys who could convince Ryan to leave. Thomas declined, not wanting to fight violence with violence, but he appreciated the offer. The community was rallying slowly and imperfectly, but rallying nonetheless. Still, the strain took its toll. Thomas lost weight, his sleep fractured by vigilance and worry. Sarah developed dark circles under her eyes that no amount of rest seemed to fix. Ethan became a shadow of himself, quiet and watchful, flinching at sudden movements. They were under siege, and sieges either broke or were lifted. There was no middle ground. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Thomas was alone in the shop when the door burst open. Ryan stood in the doorway, and this time the mask was off. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes wild, his body vibrating with barely contained violence. Where is she? Not here. Ryan crossed the distance in 3 strides, grabbing Thomas by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The impact drove the breath from Thomas's lungs, sent stars exploding across his vision. I'm done playing games. Ryan's face was inches away, his breath hot and sour with alcohol. I'm taking my son, tonight. Either you tell me where they are, or I will beat it out of you. Thomas could feel the man's strength, the coiled power in his grip. He knew he could not match it. But he also knew something else. Sarah and Ethan were at Dorothy's house, had been there all day for safety, and he would die before he told this man where to find them. I don't know where they are. Ryan's fist connected with his ribs. The pain was immediate and explosive, driving another gasp from Thomas's lips. Wrong answer. Another blow. Another. Thomas felt something crack, felt blood in his mouth, felt the world narrowing to a tunnel of pain and determination. I don't know. Ryan dropped him. Thomas crumpled to the floor, gasping, clutching his sides. Through the haze of pain, he saw Ryan moving toward the back of the shop, toward the room where Sarah and Ethan had been living. They're not here. Ryan ignored him, kicking open the door to the back room. Thomas heard his roar of frustration when he found it empty, heard things being thrown, furniture overturned. Then Ryan was back standing over him, his boot pressing down on Thomas's chest. "You're going to tell me," Ryan said, "or I'm going to break every bone in your body." Thomas looked up at the man above him, at the rage and the pain and the broken pieces that had once been a human being. He thought about fighting back, about the shotgun he kept near the door, about all the ways this could end in blood. But he also thought about something else, about the photograph in his wallet, about Jamie's face frozen forever at 6 years old, about the drunk driver who had killed him, who had walked away with nothing but a broken collarbone and a suspended license. Thomas had hated that man, had dreamed of finding him, of hurting him, of making him pay. But in the end, he had let it go. Not forgiveness, not really. Just the recognition that hatred was a poison that killed the one who carried it. Ryan was that driver. Different circumstances, different tragedies, but the same fundamental truth. A broken man destroying himself and everyone around him. "You're not going to break me," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Because you're already broken. You've been broken for years. And breaking me won't fix you. Nothing will fix you except help that you refuse to get." Ryan's face contorted. His boot pressed harder, making breathing difficult. "You don't know anything about me. I know you lost a daughter." Thomas gasped for air. "I know it destroyed you. I know you blamed Sarah because it was easier than blaming the universe. And I know that every time you hurt someone, you're trying to make the pain stop, but it doesn't stop. It never stops. Not like that. Shut up. I lost my son." Thomas's voice cracked. 3 years ago. And I wanted to hurt people. I wanted the world to burn because how dare it keep existing when my boy was gone. Ryan's boot lifted slightly. He was listening. But hurting people doesn't bring them back. Thomas struggled to sit up, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. It just makes more broken people. More lost children. More grief. You want to honor Emma's memory. Then be the father Ethan needs. Not this. This isn't who you were. This isn't who you have to be. Silence. Ryan stood over him, chest heaving, fists clenched. The rage was still there, but something else was fighting it now. Something that might have been recognition. Then the door burst open. Sarah stood in the doorway, Ethan behind her. Her face was pale, her eyes wild, and in her hands was the shotgun that Thomas kept by the door. "Get away from him." Her voice was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. She held the shotgun like someone who had never held one before, awkward and uncertain. But her finger was on the trigger, and her eyes were fixed on her husband. Ryan turned slowly. His hands came up, palms out. "Sarah, I called the police. They're on their way." Sarah's voice shook, but she did not lower the weapon. "It's over, Ryan. It's over." For a moment, the world held its breath. 3 broken people suspended in a tableau of violence and fear. A man who had lost himself to rage. A woman who had finally found the courage to fight back. And between them, a child watching everything, learning everything, his future hanging in the balance. Then Ryan Mitchell did something no one expected. He sat down on the floor, he put his head in his hands, and he began to cry. The police arrived 8 minutes later. They found Ryan still sitting on the floor, Sarah still holding the shotgun, Thomas still bleeding on the ground. The scene was chaotic, confusing, difficult to process. They arrested Ryan for assault and battery. He did not resist. He did not speak. He just let them handcuff him and lead him to the patrol car, his face blank, his eyes empty. Thomas was taken to the hospital where they diagnosed 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, and multiple contusions. He would heal. The body always healed given time. Sarah sat by his bed in the emergency room, Ethan asleep in the chair beside her, and held his hand. "You could have died. I didn't. Why didn't you fight back?" Thomas considered the question. "Because fighting wouldn't have changed anything. He was going to hurt me whether I resisted or not. The only thing I could control was what I said. And sometimes words matter more than fists." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "What you said to him? About Emma? About being broken?" Thomas squeezed her hand. "It was true, all of it. He's not a monster. He's a man who went through hell and never found his way back. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might explain it. What happens now? Now we wait. The legal system will do what it does. And maybe if he gets the help he needs, he can become something other than what he's been." "Do you really believe that?" Thomas thought about it, about Ryan's face when he talked about Emma, about the tears at the end, about the broken man underneath the violence. I believe people can change, he said. Whether they choose to is another matter. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I'm tired. I'm so tired of being afraid. I know. When will it be over? Thomas looked at her at the exhaustion and the hope and the fragile strength in her eyes. I don't know, he said honestly, but whatever comes next, you won't face it alone. Sarah leaned forward, resting her head on his chest, careful of his injuries. They stayed like that, two survivors holding on to each other, while the hospital moved around them with its own rhythm of crisis and recovery. And somewhere in the back of Thomas's mind, a thought crystallized. For the first time in 3 years, he had a reason to keep living. A reason beyond grief and guilt and the weight of everything he had lost. A reason that had names and faces and a future that was not yet written. Sarah, Ethan, the strange broken family that had formed in the wreckage of their lives. It was not what he had expected. It was not what he had wanted. But it was what he had. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The winter continued outside the hospital windows, snow falling in the darkness. But inside, in the warmth and the silence, something was beginning. Not an ending, not yet, but a beginning. A fragile, uncertain, precious beginning. And that was something worth fighting for. The hospital released Thomas 3 days after the assault, his ribs wrapped tight, his body a map of purple and yellow bruises that would take weeks to fade. Sarah drove him home in his own truck, her hands gripping the wheel with the particular intensity of someone who had spent too many years not being in control of anything. Ethan sat in the backseat, silent and watchful, his eyes moving between the road ahead and Thomas's face in the rearview mirror. The boy had not spoken much since that night, had retreated into himself the way children do when the world becomes too heavy to process. The shop looked different in the gray afternoon light. The broken door had been repaired courtesy of Pete and 2 of his friends who had shown up the morning after with tools and lumber, and the gruff kindness of men who did not know how to express their concern with words. The bloodstains had been scrubbed from the concrete floor, though Thomas could still see the faint outline if he looked hard enough. He did not look hard enough. The first week back was a blur of pain medication and fitful sleep, and the slow grinding work of recovery. Thomas spent most of his time on the couch in his apartment, alternating between watching television he did not care about and staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation in his mind. Ryan's face, the rage giving way to something else, the tears at the end. Thomas had seen something in that moment, something that complicated his understanding of the man who had terrorized them for weeks. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but recognition. The recognition of one broken man looking at another. Sarah took over the day-to-day operations of the shop, handling customers with the same fierce competence she brought to everything else. She knew nothing about motorcycles, but she knew how to schedule appointments and answer phones and explain to people that the owner was recovering from an injury and would be back soon. Dorothy came by every evening bringing food and conversation and the steady presence of someone who had weathered her own storms. She would sit with Thomas while Sarah put Ethan to bed, and they would talk about nothing in particular, letting the silence fill the spaces between words. One evening, about 10 days after the assault, Dorothy said something that stuck with Thomas long after she left. You know what the hardest part of grief is? It's not the big moments, not the anniversaries or the holidays, or the times when you expect it to hurt. It's the small ones, the everyday things that remind you of what you lost. A song on the radio, a smell in the air, the way the light falls through a window at a certain time of day. Thomas knew exactly what she meant. He had spent 3 years being ambushed by those small moments, the unexpected punches that left him gasping. But lately, Dorothy continued, I've been watching you, and I've seen something change. You're still grieving, you always will be, but you're also living, and that's something you weren't doing before. What changed? Dorothy smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You found something worth living for. Or rather, someone found you. Thomas thought about Sarah, about Ethan, about the way they had walked into his life and somehow become essential to it. He thought about the confrontation with Ryan, about the words he had spoken, about the strange clarity that had come to him in the midst of the violence. I don't know if I saved them or they saved me. Does it matter? Thomas considered this. Maybe not. Maybe the only thing that mattered was that they were all still here, still breathing, still fighting. Maybe he agreed. The legal proceedings began 2 weeks after Ryan's arrest. Thomas had never been involved in a criminal case before, and the experience was disorienting. Meetings with prosecutors, statements to police, preliminary hearings that stretched for hours and seemed to accomplish nothing. The system moved slowly, grinding through procedures and paperwork and delays that seemed designed to exhaust everyone involved. Ryan had been charged with assault and battery breaking and entering and terroristic threatening. His lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who had driven up from Cleveland, argued that his client was a decorated veteran suffering from untreated PTSD, that the assault was an aberration, that Ryan deserved treatment, not punishment. The prosecutor, a young woman named Martinez, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, pushed back hard. She presented evidence of the harassment campaign, the stalking, the documented pattern of violence. She called Sarah to testify about the years of abuse, and Sarah sat on the witness stand and told her story with a voice that shook but did not break. Thomas watched from the gallery, his ribs still aching, and felt something he did not expect: pity. Not for the violence, not for the terror, but for the man underneath it all. The man who had gone to war and come back broken. The man who had lost a daughter and never recovered. The man who had destroyed his family because he did not know how to live with his own pain. It did not excuse anything. It did not change anything. But it complicated the simple narrative of monster and victim. After Sarah's testimony, the judge called a recess. Thomas found her in the hallway outside the courtroom, leaning against the wall, her face pale and drawn. "You did good in there. I told the truth. That's all. The truth matters." Sarah looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that he had not seen before, a weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. "He's going to get out," she said. "The lawyer's good, and Ryan knows how to play the system. He'll get probation or suspended sentence or whatever they call it, and then he'll be free." The prosecutor seems confident. The prosecutor doesn't know him. Sarah's voice was flat. "I do. He'll say whatever they want to hear. He'll play the troubled veteran, the grieving father, and they'll believe him because it's easier than facing the truth." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to offer reassurance, but he could not. He had seen the way the defense lawyer worked, the way he spun Ryan's violence into a symptom of something beyond his control. It was effective, it was persuasive, and it was working. What do we do if he gets out? We keep going. Sarah's jaw tightened. "We've been fighting for this long." "We don't stop now." Thomas nodded. It was not much of a plan, but it was something. The trial stretched across 3 weeks, a grinding marathon of testimony and cross-examination and legal maneuvering that left everyone exhausted. Thomas testified about the assault, describing the blows in clinical detail, answering questions about his injuries, his fear, his state of mind. The defense lawyer tried to paint him as the aggressor, suggesting that Thomas had provoked Ryan, that he had inserted himself into a domestic matter that did not concern him. Thomas kept his voice steady, his answers clear, refusing to be baited. "I didn't provoke anyone. I was alone in my shop when he broke down the door. I didn't fight back because I knew I couldn't win a physical confrontation. I just tried to survive." "And in your opinion," the lawyer asked with a smirk that did not reach his eyes, "why did my client attack you?" Thomas looked at Ryan, sitting at the defense table with his hands folded and his face carefully blank. "Because I was standing between him and what he thought belonged to him. His wife, his son. He couldn't accept that they had chosen to leave, so he tried to take them back by force. And do you think my client is a dangerous man?" Thomas considered the question. He thought about everything he had learned, everything he had seen, everything he had felt in the moments when Ryan's boot was pressing down on his chest. "I think your client is a broken man," he said finally. "I think he went through things that no one should have to go through, and he never got the help he needed. I think he's been in pain for so long that he doesn't know how to exist without it. And I think that pain has made him capable of terrible things." The courtroom was silent, but being broken doesn't make you dangerous. Thomas continued, "Choosing not to heal does. Choosing to pour your pain onto other people instead of dealing with it yourself. That's what makes someone dangerous." The defense lawyer had no follow-up questions. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon, gray skies, threatening rain. Guilty on all counts. Thomas watched Ryan's face as the jury foreman read the verdict. There was no surprise there, no anger, no visible reaction at all. Just that same empty mask that Ryan had worn throughout the trial. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The prosecutor was asking for 5 years in state prison. The defense was pushing for probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment. The judge would decide. In the meantime, Ryan would remain in custody, his bail revoked after the guilty verdict. It was over, at least this part of it. Sarah cried when they got outside the courthouse. Not sobs, just silent tears streaming down her face as she stood in the parking lot looking up at the gray sky. Thomas stood beside her, not speaking, not touching, just present. "I thought I would feel different," she said finally. "I thought when they said guilty, I would feel free, or happy, or something." "What do you feel?" "Nothing." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, just an empty. Thomas understood. He had felt the same way after the drunk driver who killed Jamie was convicted. He had expected closure, had expected the verdict to fill some of the void. But the void did not work that way. It did not care about justice or revenge or any of the things that humans told themselves would help. The void was its own thing. It existed independent of circumstances. And the only way to deal with it was to keep moving, to keep building, to keep finding reasons to get up in the morning. "It gets better," Thomas said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. Promise." He thought about the 3 years he had spent in the dick, the nights with the whiskey and the gun, the mornings when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. "No," he said honestly, "I can't promise, but I can tell you that I'm still here. And I didn't think I would be. So maybe that's something." Sarah looked at him and something shifted in her expression. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. Maybe she agreed. The weeks between the verdict and the sentencing were strange, suspended. Thomas returned to work. His ribs mostly healed his body, slowly recovering from the damage. Customers came back, some out of loyalty, some out of curiosity, some just because they needed their motorcycles fixed, and he was the best mechanic in the county. Sarah continued working at the diner, promoted now to assistant manager. Her competence and work ethic impossible to ignore. She started saving money, talking about maybe finding an apartment of her own, something with a real kitchen and a bedroom for Ethan. Thomas told her she did not have to rush, that the room behind the shop was hers as long as she needed it. But he understood the impulse. She needed to build something of her own, something that did not depend on anyone else's charity. Ethan returned to school, slowly reintegrating into the rhythms of childhood. He still had nightmares, still flinched at loud noises, still carried the scars of everything he had witnessed. But he was also laughing again, asking questions again, being a child in all the ways that children should be. One afternoon, about a week before the sentencing, Ethan asked Thomas a question that caught him off guard. "Uncle Tom, do you think my dad is a bad person?" They were in the garage, Thomas working on a carburetor, Ethan sitting on his usual crate with a comic book in his lap. The question came out of nowhere, dropped into the comfortable silence like a stone into still water. Thomas set down his wrench, giving the boy his full attention. "That's a complicated question." "I know, but do you?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. He thought about Ryan's face in the courtroom, about the tears in the garage, about everything Sarah had told him about the man Ryan used to be. "I think your dad did bad things, terrible things, things that hurt you and your mom and can't be undone." "So he's bad." Thomas shook his head. "People aren't that simple, buddy. Your dad went to war. He saw things that changed him. He lost your sister Emma, and that broke something inside him. None of that excuses what he did, but it helps explain it." Ethan's face was thoughtful, processing. "My mom says he used to be different. Before the war. Maybe he was." Thomas picked up the wrench again, needing something to do with his hands. Maybe the person he used to be is still in there somewhere, but the person he became did terrible things, and he has to face the consequences for that. Will he go to prison? Probably, for a while. And then what? Then he'll have a choice. He can try to get better to become someone different, or he can stay the same. That's up to him. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you think people can change?" Thomas looked at the boy, at his earnest face and worried eyes. "I think they can choose to try. Whether they succeed depends on how hard they work at it." Ethan nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something he had been wrestling with. "I hope he tries," the boy said quietly. "I don't want him to be the bad guy forever." Thomas felt his throat tighten. Even after everything, after all the fear and the pain and the violence, this child still wanted to believe in his father, still wanted there to be hope. Me too, buddy, Thomas said. Me too. The sentencing hearing came on a cold morning in early January. The courtroom was packed. People from Millbrook who had followed the case, reporters from regional newspapers, court observers who had nothing better to do. Thomas sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, Sarah beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Ryan was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, his face showing the effects of weeks in county jail. He looked thinner, older, diminished somehow, as if the process of being held accountable had physically reduced him. The defense lawyer made one final pitch for leniency, painting Ryan as a hero who had sacrificed his mental health in service to his country. He invoked the names of programs and treatments, promised that with proper support, Ryan could be rehabilitated. The prosecutor countered with the facts. The years of abuse, the stalking, the assault that had left Thomas with cracked ribs, the pattern of escalating violence that showed no signs of stopping on its own. Then the judge asked if Ryan wanted to make a statement. Thomas watched as Ryan rose slowly, his chains clinking. He turned to face the gallery, and for the first time since the trial began, his eyes found Sarah. I don't expect forgiveness. Ryan's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I don't deserve it. What I did to you, to Ethan, to this man who was just trying to help, there's no excuse. He paused, swallowing hard. I used to be someone else, someone who believed in things, someone who wanted to make the world better. Then I went to war and I saw what humans are capable of, the cruelty, the waste, the absolute meaninglessness of it all. His hands were shaking. When I came home, I couldn't turn it off. I couldn't stop seeing the faces, couldn't stop hearing the sounds. I tried to be normal, tried to be a husband and a father, but the person I was before didn't exist anymore. And I didn't know how to tell anyone, didn't know how to ask for help. So I drank, and I raged, and I destroyed the only people who ever loved me. Tears were running down his face now. Emma. He said the name like a prayer. My daughter. She died because the world is cruel and random and doesn't care about our plans. Not because of Sarah. Never because of Sarah. I blamed her because I couldn't blame the universe, because I needed someone to be angry at. He turned to face Thomas. You were right. What you said that night. I was trying to make the pain stop by giving it to other people. And all I did was create more pain, more broken people. He looked at the judge. Whatever you decide, I accept. I've earned it. But I want you to know that I'm going to try. Not because I expect it to change my sentence, but because I have a son. And even if he never wants to see me again, I want him to know that his father tried to be better. That in the end, I didn't just give up. Ryan sat down. The courtroom was silent. The judge took a long moment before speaking, shuffling papers, composing her thoughts. Mr. Mitchell, she said finally, this court has heard extensive testimony about your actions and your history. There is no doubt that you have committed serious crimes. There is also no doubt that you have suffered greatly both in service to your country and in your personal life. She folded her hands. However, suffering does not excuse violence, and the pattern of behavior you have exhibited suggests that without significant intervention, you will continue to pose a danger to those around you. Thomas felt Sarah tense beside him. The court sentences you to 4 years in state prison. The judge continued with eligibility for parole after 18 months contingent on successful completion of a mental health treatment program. Additionally, upon release, you will be subject to a 5-year restraining order prohibiting any contact with Sarah Mitchell, Ethan Mitchell, or Thomas Hayes. She looked directly at Ryan. I hope you meant what you said, Mr. Mitchell. I hope you use this time to become the person you claim to want to be. Because if you appear before this court again on similar charges, I will not be as lenient. The gavel came down. The hearing was over. Thomas walked out of the courthouse into cold January sunshine. Sarah was beside him, Ethan between them, the boy's hand gripping his mother's tightly. 4 years, Sarah said. Her voice was flat, processing. 18 months with good behavior, Thomas replied. Is that enough time? Thomas looked at her, at the fear and the hope fighting for dominance in her eyes. I don't know, he said honestly, but it's time, and that's more than we had before. They stood there for a moment, the three of them facing whatever came next. The trial was over. The immediate danger had passed, but the future remained uncertain, a road stretching ahead with no clear destination. What now? Sarah asked. Thomas thought about the shop, about the diner, about the small town that had become home. He thought about Friday nights at Riverside and Sunday mornings in the garage and all the ordinary moments that had somehow come to matter. Now we live, he said. We keep going. We build something worth having. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time in months, she smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. That sounds like a plan. They walked to the truck together, the three of them. Behind them, the courthouse loomed gray and imposing. Ahead, the road wound through town, past the shops and houses they had come to know, toward whatever waited on the other side. And somewhere deep inside, in the place where grief and hope existed, side by side, Thomas felt something shift. Not an ending, not quite a beginning, but a turning point. A moment when the story could go in any direction. He chose forward. They all did. The months after the sentencing passed like water, finding its levels slowly settling into patterns that felt almost normal. Spring came to Millbrook with its usual reluctance, winter holding on through March before finally releasing its grip. The snow melted in stages, revealing the brown grass beneath, then the first tentative shoots of green. Trees budded, birds returned. The world continued its ancient cycle of death and renewal, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath its notice. Thomas returned to work fully. His ribs healed, his body restored to something approaching its former condition. The bruises had faded weeks ago, leaving behind only the occasional twinge. When he moved wrong, a physical reminder of what had happened that grew fainter with each passing day. The shop picked up business as word spread that the drama was over. Customers who had stayed away during the worst of it began returning, some sheepish, some curious, most just needing their motorcycles fixed and not particularly caring about the personal life of the man who fixed them. Thomas welcomed them all with the same quiet professionalism he had always shown, neither inviting conversation about what had happened nor shutting it down when it arose. Sarah found an apartment in April, a small two-bedroom place above the hardware store on Main Street. It was nothing fancy, cramped kitchen and thin walls and a bathroom that required creative scheduling, but it was hers. She paid the rent with money she had earned, signed the lease with her own name, and stood in the empty living room on move-in day with tears streaming down her face. Thomas helped her move loading boxes into his truck, carrying furniture up the narrow staircase, assembling the bed frame that came in pieces with instructions written in 3 languages, none of them quite English. Ethan ran from room to room, claiming spaces, already planning where his toys would go and which corner would be best for reading. It felt like progress. It felt like healing. It felt like the beginning of something that might actually last. The Friday night dinners continued, but they had changed. Thomas still went to Riverside Diner every week, still sat in his corner booth, still ordered 2 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. But now there were 3 plates instead of 2, and the seats across from him were no longer empty. Sarah and Ethan joined him most weeks, their presence transforming the ritual from an act of mourning into something else entirely. The booth that had once been a shrine to grief became a gathering place for this strange family they had assembled, bound not by blood but by circumstance and choice. Dorothy watched these transformations with quiet satisfaction. She never commented directly, never drew attention to the changes she observed, but Thomas caught her smiling sometimes when she brought their food, a particular warmth in her eyes that had not been there before. One evening in late May, after Ethan had fallen asleep in the booth with his head on his mother's lap, Dorothy slid into the seat beside Thomas and spoke in a low voice. "You know what I see when I look at you now." Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I see a man who figured out the secret." "What secret?" "That grief and joy can exist in the same heart. That loving someone new doesn't mean forgetting someone old. That moving forward isn't the same as moving on." Thomas looked at the blue backpack still hanging on its hook, faded and worn, but still present. Beside it hung a red backpack, newer, brighter, belonging to a living child who used it every day for school. "I didn't figure anything out. Things just happened." Dorothy shook her head. "Things don't just happen. People make choices. You chose to help a stranger when you could have looked away. You chose to keep fighting when you could have given up. You chose to build something new instead of staying buried in the rubble of the old." She patted his hand. "That's not nothing, Tom. That's everything." Summer arrived hot and heavy, the Ohio humidity settling over Millbrook like a wet blanket. Thomas installed a window air conditioning unit in the garage, the ancient machine rattling and groaning, but managing to keep the temperature bearable. Ethan spent his summer vacation at the shop just as he had done the year before. But the boy who sat on the overturned crate now was different from the frightened child who had first arrived. He laughed more easily. He asked questions without hesitation. He moved through the world with the particular confidence of a child who knew he was safe. The nightmares had mostly stopped. Sarah reported that he slept through the night now most nights, and when bad dreams did come, they were the ordinary monsters of childhood, not the specific terrors of his past. One afternoon, while Thomas was showing Ethan how to change oil, the boy asked a question that had clearly been building for some time. "Uncle Tom, are you and my mom going to get married?" Thomas nearly dropped the oil filter. He looked at Ethan at the earnest curiosity in the boy's face and felt the weight of the question. "What makes you ask that? Jimmy Patterson said that when a man and a woman live together, they're supposed to get married. He said it's weird that you don't." Thomas set down the filter, giving the conversation his full attention. "Your mom doesn't live with me anymore. She has her own apartment." "I know, but we still come here all the time. And you come to our place for dinner, and you're always around." Ethan's forehead wrinkled. "It feels like we're a family, but Jimmy says families have to be married." Thomas considered how to explain something that he was not sure he fully understood himself. "Families come in lots of different shapes, buddy. Some have a mom and a dad who are married. I'm bad at them. Some have two moms or two dads. Some have grandparents raising kids or aunts and uncles or just one parent doing everything. What shape is our family?" Thomas thought about it. "I guess we're the kind of family where people choose each other. Your mom and I aren't married and we're not going to be. But we care about each other. We help each other. We show up when things are hard, like when my dad came, like when your dad came." Thomas held the boy's gaze. Family isn't about what you call each other or whether there's a piece of paper that says you belong together. It's about who you can count on, who shows up, who stays. Ethan processed this, his young mind working through the concepts. "So you're like my family, even though you're not my dad. I'm not trying to be your dad. Your dad is your dad, whatever happens between him and your mom. But I can be someone else, someone who cares about you and wants to help you grow up right. What do I call you then?" Thomas smiled. "You've been calling me Uncle Tom for almost a year now. That seems to work pretty well." Ethan grinned, the tension breaking. "Okay, Uncle Tom. Can we finish changing the oil now?" They returned to the lesson, but something had shifted. The conversation had named what they were to each other, had given shape to the undefined relationship that had grown between them. It was not father and son. It was not replacing what had been lost. It was something new, something that existed on its own terms, and that was enough. The letter arrived in August, forwarded from the state prison where Ryan Mitchell was serving his sentence. Sarah brought it to Thomas, her hands trembling, the envelope unopened. She stood in the doorway of the shop, backlit by summer sunshine, and held it out like something that might explode. "It's from him." "I don't know if I should read it." Thomas wiped his hands on a rag, studying her face. "Do you want to read it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to throw it away." "But another part." She trailed off, unable to articulate what the other part wanted. "You could let me read it first. Tell you what it says." Sarah considered this, then shook her head. "No, if I'm going to read it, I should read it myself. I'm just scared of what it says, of what I might feel." Thomas understood. The complexity of emotions that Ryan evoked could not be easily categorized. He had been her husband, the father of her children, the man she had once loved enough to marry. He had also been her abuser, her tormentor, the source of years of fear and pain. Both things were true. Both things would always be true. Whatever it says, Thomas told her, it doesn't change anything. "You're safe. Ethan's safe. He can't hurt you from in there." Sarah nodded slowly. She tore open the envelope, extracted the single sheet of paper inside, and began to read. Thomas watched her face as her eyes moved across the words. He saw surprise, then confusion, then something that might have been sadness. When she finished, she lowered the letter and stood in silence for a long moment. "What does it say?" Sarah handed him the letter. He took it, unfolded it, and read. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the penmanship of someone who had not written much by hand in years. The words were simple, direct, without the manipulative undertones that Thomas had half expected. "Sarah, I am in a program here for veterans with PTSD. For the first time, I am talking about what happened to me, what I saw, what I did. It does not excuse anything, but it helps me understand. I was broken and I broke you and Ethan instead of asking for help. That was wrong. I will spend the rest of my life knowing it was wrong. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am not asking for another chance. I just want you to know that I am trying to become someone different. Someone who deserves to be Ethan's father even if I never get to see him again. Tell him I love him. Tell him I am sorry, Ryan. Thomas folded the letter and handed it back. What do you think? Sarah asked. I think it's a start. Whether it leads anywhere depends on what he does next. Should I write back? Thomas shook his head. That's not my decision to make. It's yours. Sarah looked at the letter for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. I'm going to wait, she said. See if there are more letters. See if this is real or just something he's saying to make himself feel better. That sounds wise. Sarah turned to go, then stopped at the door. Thank you for being here, for being you. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. She left, and he stood alone in the garage with the smell of oil and metal, thinking about broken men and the long road toward redemption. Autumn painted Millbrook in shades of orange and gold, the maples along Main Street putting on their annual show. Thomas watched the leaves change from the window of his shop, marking time by the progression of colors. The anniversary approached without fanfare. 1 year since Sarah and Ethan had walked into the diner. 1 year since his life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. He thought about marking it, somehow doing something to acknowledge the significance. But in the end, he decided that the best way to honor the anniversary was simply to live it. To show up for another Friday night dinner, another Saturday morning with Ethan in the garage, another ordinary day in the extraordinary life they had built. Sarah seemed to have the same idea. She arrived at the diner that Friday with a small gift wrapped in paper that Ethan had decorated with crayons. 1 year, she said, placing the package in front of Thomas. I wanted to get you something. Thomas unwrapped it carefully, peeling back the crayon-covered paper to reveal a picture frame. Inside was a photograph he had never seen before. Sarah, Ethan, and Thomas sitting in this very booth, laughing at something that the camera had not captured. Dorothy must have taken it without their knowledge, preserving a moment of genuine happiness. When was this? About a month ago. Dorothy gave it to me, said she thought you might want it. Thomas studied the photograph. His own face was almost unrecognizable, not because of physical changes, but because of the expression. He was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and genuine. I don't have any pictures of us, Sarah continued. Of whatever we are, I wanted one, and I thought you might want one too. Thomas set the frame on the table between them, angling it so they could both see. Thank you, he said, and the words felt inadequate, but he did not have better ones. Ethan appeared at that moment, sliding into the booth with the particular energy of a 7-year-old who had been released from the constraint of walking slowly. What's that? He pointed at the frame. A picture of us, Thomas said. Ethan studied it with the critical eye of someone who took such things very seriously. I look weird. You look like yourself. I don't look weird. No, Thomas agreed. You don't look weird. The boy grinned, satisfied, and turned his attention to the menu he already knew by heart. Dorothy brought their food without being asked. 3 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, extra gravy on the side for Ethan, exactly as it had been every Friday for months now. Special occasion, she asked, nodding at the photograph. Anniversary, Sarah said. 1 year. Dorothy's face softened. 1 year. She shook her head slowly. Feels like longer, in a good way. She walked away and the 3 of them ate together in the diner filled with the comfortable sounds of people being together. After dinner, they walked back to Sarah's apartment. The night was cool, autumn asserting itself, and Ethan ran ahead, kicking through piles of fallen leaves with the abandon of childhood. Thomas and Sarah walked side by side, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. What are you thinking about? Sarah asked. Thomas considered the question. Honestly, I'm thinking about how different everything is. A year ago, I was eating alone in that booth, waiting to die, without having the courage to actually do it. Now what? Now I have something to live for. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, me too. They reached the apartment building, and Ethan came running back, leaves stuck in his hair, and a grin on his face. Can Uncle Tom come up? Can he read me a story? Thomas looked at Sarah, who nodded. If he wants to, she said, I want to. They climbed the stairs together, 3 people who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. Not a traditional family, not what any of them had planned or expected, but real and present and enough. The winter that followed was milder than the year before, the cold arriving late and leaving early. Thomas used the extra time to catch up on projects that had been neglected, repairing equipment and reorganizing the shop, and making improvements that he had put off for years. Sarah got a promotion at the diner, taking over as manager when the previous manager retired. The increased responsibility came with increased pay, and she began talking about saving for a house, something small but permanent, a place that would truly be her own. Ethan finished first grade with good marks and better friends. He had integrated fully into the social fabric of Millbrook, becoming just another kid in a small town, his troubled past unknown to classmates who only saw the cheerful boy who asked too many questions and laughed too easily. Letters from Ryan continued to arrive one every month or so. Sarah read them all, never responding, never discarding them either. She kept them in a shoebox in her closet, documentation of a man's attempt to change himself. The letters grew more coherent as the months passed, more self-aware. Ryan wrote about his therapy sessions, about the things he was learning, about the guilt he carried. He never asked for forgiveness. He never pleaded for another chance. He just reported on his progress like someone filing regular updates on a project that might never be completed. One day in early spring, Sarah brought one of the letters to Thomas. "He's being released next month," she said. "Early for good behavior. He finished the treatment program. They say he's made genuine progress." Thomas set down the wrench he was holding. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared." Sarah's voice was small. "But also, I don't know, something else." "What kind of something else?" "I think he might actually be different." "The letters, they don't sound like him. The old him, I mean. They sound like someone who's actually thinking about what they did instead of just making excuses." Thomas considered this. People can change, it happens, but it takes more than letters to prove it. "I know." Sarah rubbed her arms as if cold. "He wants to see Ethan. When he gets out, not right away. He says he'll wait until Ethan is ready. However long that takes. What does Ethan want?" "I haven't told him yet. I wanted to talk to you first." Thomas was touched by this, by the way she had come to value his opinion, to include him in decisions that were not technically his to make. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want Ethan to have a chance at a relationship with his father. A real one. But I also want him to be safe, and I don't know how to have both." Thomas thought about his own father, about the complicated love that had existed between them. He thought about Jamie, about all the conversations they would never have, all the chances that had been stolen. "Maybe you start small," he suggested. "Supervise visits, public places, see how it goes. And if it goes badly, then you stop. You're the parent. You get to decide." Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Will you be there for the first meeting, in case?" Thomas did not hesitate. "Of course." She smiled, a relief flooding her features. "Thank you. I don't think I could do this alone." "You're not alone," Thomas said. "That's the point." The first meeting happened in June in the park at the center of town. Ryan arrived looking thin and pale, the prison pallor still clinging to his skin. He moved carefully, as if uncertain of his right to occupy space in the world. His eyes found Ethan immediately, and something passed across his face, something raw and vulnerable that Thomas had never seen before. Ethan stood between his mother and Thomas, holding both their hands. He had agreed to the meeting after long conversations with Sarah, after careful preparation and many questions. He had decided that he wanted to see, his father wanted to know if the man had really changed. But that did not mean he was not afraid. Ryan approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. He knelt down, bringing himself to Ethan's level, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Hi, buddy." Ethan did not respond. He just looked at his father, studying him with the particular intensity of a child trying to reconcile memory with reality. "I know I scared you," Ryan continued. "I know I hurt you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Still, Ethan said nothing. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me." Ryan's voice cracked. "I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better. And if you ever want to talk to me or see me or even just yell at me, I'll be here." Silence stretched between them. Thomas watched, ready to intervene if necessary, but sensing that this was a moment that needed to happen on its own terms. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Mom says you were sick. That's why you did bad things." Ryan nodded slowly. I am. But that's not an excuse. Sick people still have to take responsibility for what they do. Are you better now? I'm getting better. Every day, a little more. It takes a long time. Ethan, consider this. My friend Marcus has asthma. He has to use an inhaler every day. Is it like that? Something like that. Ryan's lips curved into a small, sad smile. Except my inhaler is talking to people. Doctors. Other veterans. Learning how to handle the things in my head. Are the things in your head gone? No, they'll never be completely gone. But I'm learning how to live with them without hurting the people I love. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he released Thomas's hand and took a step forward. I drew you a picture, the boy said. Mom said I should give it to you if I wanted to. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out. Ryan took it with trembling hands, unfolded it, and looked at what his son had created. Thomas could not see the image from where he stood, but he saw Ryan's reaction. The man's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It's us, Ethan explained. You and me and Mom. From before, when we used to go to the park. Ryan could not speak. He just knelt there, holding the picture, crying in a way that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. I remember too, Ethan said quietly. The good parts, before everything got bad. Ryan finally found his voice. I'm going to get that back. I'm going to earn it back, even if it takes forever. Ethan nodded solemnly. Okay, but you have to be patient. Mom says trust takes a long time to build and only a second to break. Your mom is right, I know. Ethan glanced back at Sarah. She's smart. The meeting lasted another half-hour, cautious conversation and careful boundaries. When it was over, Ryan thanked Sarah, and Thomas shook hands with both of them and walked away without looking back. In the car on the way home, Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, processing everything that had happened. How do you feel? Sarah asked. Ethan thought about it. I feel like maybe things can get better. Not all at once, but maybe. Sarah looked at Thomas and something passed between them. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Maybe, Sarah agreed. We'll see. The months that followed brought slow, incremental progress. Ryan found an apartment in Columbus far enough away to respect the boundaries, but close enough for occasional visits. He got a job at a garage using skills he had learned before the war, and he attended his therapy sessions religiously, never missing an appointment. The visits with Ethan continued, gradually expanding from supervised meetings in public places to afternoon outings to eventually occasional dinners at restaurants, where the three of them, Ryan, Sarah, and Ethan, could sit together and practice being civil. Thomas was not part of these dinners. That was appropriate, he thought. Whatever Ryan and Sarah needed to work out between them, whatever relationship they would eventually have as co-parents, it needed to be theirs. But he remained present in other ways. Friday dinners at the diner, Saturday mornings in the garage, the ordinary fabric of the life they had built. One Friday evening in October, exactly 2 years after Sarah and Ethan had first walked into Riverside Diner, Thomas sat in his usual booth and looked at the 2 backpacks hanging on the hook. The blue one faded and worn, belonging to a boy who had been gone for 5 years now. The red one newer but starting to show signs of use, belonging to a boy who was very much alive. Sarah slid into the seat across from him, Ethan beside her. You're thinking about him, she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. Always on days like this. Tell me about him. Thomas looked at her, surprised. He had never talked about Jamie to anyone except in the most general terms. The grief had always felt too private, too sacred to share. But Sarah waited, patient and open, and something in her expression made him want to try. He was loud, Thomas began. Could never do anything quietly. Always running, always yelling, always making his presence known. The words came slowly at first, then faster, a dam breaking. He told her about Jamie's laugh, about his obsession with superheroes, about the way he would ask questions without waiting for answers. He told her about the Friday night dinners, about the extra gravy, about the mess that always followed. He told her about the accident, about waking up in the hospital, about the 3 years of darkness that followed. And he told her about the night she had walked into the diner, about the second plate of food, about the moment when he had decided to help a stranger and accidentally saved himself. When he finished, Sarah's eyes were wet with tears. Thank you, she said. For telling me, thank you, Thomas replied, for listening. Ethan had been quiet throughout, absorbing the story with the particular attention of a child who understood that something important was happening. Uncle Tom, he said finally, is it okay if I say something? Of course. I think Jamie would have liked me. And I think I would have liked him. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Yeah, buddy, I think so too. Maybe we can be like brothers, even though he's not here anymore. Like honorary brothers. Thomas looked at this boy who had come into his life through chance and circumstance, who had somehow become essential to his existence. I'd like that, he said. I think Jamie would too. Dorothy arrived with their food, 3 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, extra gravy on the side. She set them down with her usual efficiency, then paused, looking at the 3 faces around the table. You know what I see, she said. Thomas smiled. What do you see? I see a family. She walked away and they ate together, and outside the window the autumn leaves fell in their ancient dance of endings and beginnings. The food was good. The company was better. And somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, Thomas felt the presence of everyone he had loved and lost, not as a weight, but as a warmth, not as an absence, but as a continuation. Grief did not end. It transformed. It made room. It learned to share space with joy and hope, and all the complicated emotions that made up a human life. Thomas reached across the table and touched the strap of the blue backpack, a gesture so familiar it had become unconscious. Then he turned back to Sarah and Ethan, to the family he had found in the wreckage of the one he had lost. Same time next week, Sarah asked. Same time next week, Thomas agreed. And that was enough. That was everything. Outside, the night settled over Millbrook, stars emerging in the darkening sky. The diner glowed warm and bright against the darkness, a beacon for travelers and locals alike. Inside, 3 people sat in a corner booth eating meatloaf and mashed potatoes, talking about nothing in particular. A man who had lost everything. A woman who had run from everything. A boy who was learning that everything could be okay. They were not a traditional family. They were not what anyone would have expected. But they were real. They were present. They were choosing each other every day in all the small ways that added up to something larger than themselves. And that was the story. Not of endings, but of beginnings. Not of what was lost, but of what was found. Not of grief alone, but of grief and joy intertwined, inseparable, both part of the same great mystery of being alive. The diner door opened and new customers came in. Dorothy greeted them with her usual warmth. The coffee pots hissed and steamed. The world continued its eternal turning. And in the corner booth, Thomas Hayes smiled at the family that had found him and felt for the first time in years like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Home.